Barrett had always believed a bullet could end a man's life, but he never imagined one would begin a promise that would follow him for the rest of his days. The smell of wet sage drifted through the small hide shelter, while smoke curled lazily toward the opening above. Somewhere outside, horses shifted their weight, leather creaked softly, and wind carried the distant song of a hawk gliding over the canyon walls. Cole tried to open his eyes, but every breath reminded him that something inside his shoulder burned like a branding iron left too long in the fire. He reached for the Colt that should have rested beside him. His hand found only a folded blanket. Panic arrived before memory. Then he heard her voice. "Do not move." It was calm, almost gentle, spoken in careful English touched by a quiet Apache rhythm. He turned his head and saw a woman kneeling beside him. Dark hair braided with faded blue beads rested over one shoulder. Her buckskin sleeves were rolled to her elbows, revealing steady hands stained green from crushed herbs instead of gunpowder. A small stone knife lay beside a bowl filled with steaming water and bundles of fresh sage. She looked nothing like the stories he'd grown up hearing around frontier campfires. She looked tired, focused, human. Cole tried to sit up anyway. Pain stopped him halfway, and the room blurred until tears stung the corners of his eyes before he could stop them. Embarrassment burned hotter than the wound itself. He lowered his face, hoping she hadn't noticed. She had, yet she said nothing. Instead, she dipped a clean strip of cloth into the warm water and gently wiped the dried dust from his shoulder. "This will hurt," she whispered. "Only for a little while." Cole clenched his jaw, expecting fear to fill her eyes when she reached for the knife. There was none. Her hands moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had saved more lives than she could remember. Outside, the wind rattled cottonwood leaves, and somewhere nearby a child laughed before being hushed by an older voice. Life continued while the world inside that little shelter stood perfectly still. The stone blade disappeared beneath the torn fabric surrounding the wound. Cole shut his eyes. His fingers dug into the rough wool beneath him. Every heartbeat echoed through his chest until suddenly the pressure eased. A dull piece of lead dropped into a wooden bowl with a soft metallic click no louder than a pebble falling into a creek. Cole exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Tears escaped despite every lesson pride had taught him. He turned away in silence. The Apache woman carefully pressed fresh herbs against the wound before wrapping it with clean linen. Only after the bandage was secured did she lift the small gray bullet between two fingers and study it beneath the morning light filtering through the shelter. Her expression changed. Not with anger, not with triumph, with concern. She looked at Cole for a long moment before quietly saying, "This bullet did not come from Apache hands." Cole stared at her, unable to answer. Everything he believed seemed to loosen as easily as the smoke drifting through the roof. She placed the bullet into a small leather pouch and tied it closed with a faded blue cord. "Keep your strength," she said as she stood. "Because when you learn who truly fired this shot." She paused, looking toward the canyon entrance where distant hoofbeats rolled like approaching thunder. "Your heart will hurt far more than your shoulder ever did." The hoofbeats faded as quickly as they had come, leaving only the whisper of the desert wind brushing against the hide walls. Cole listened until the silence settled again. He looked toward the entrance of the shelter, then back to the small leather pouch resting beside the woman. The blue cord around it seemed ordinary, yet somehow heavier than the revolver he had carried for years. He finally spoke, his voice rough from thirst. "Who are you?" She rinsed the stone blade in warm water before answering. "My name is Niyeli Red Hawk." She folded the clean cloth with slow, practiced movements. "I gather medicine. I help those who are hurt." Cole let out a tired breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "That is not what people in Dry Creek say." A faint smile touched her lips, but disappeared before it could become real. "No, it is not." Outside, sunlight spilled across the canyon floor, turning the red cliffs into walls of fire without heat. The scent of cedar drifted through the morning air. Somewhere beyond the shelter, an elderly man carved wood while children chased one another between the cottonwoods. There were no battle cries, no frightened horses, no signs of the savage camp Cole had imagined every time someone in town spoke the word Apache. He watched an older woman hand fresh bread to a young boy before the child hurried toward another family carrying a bucket of water nearly too large for him to lift alone. The image unsettled him more than any nightmare ever had. It looked too familiar, too ordinary. Niyeli noticed where his eyes had wandered. You expected something different. Cole hesitated. Every answer sounded foolish now. I expected. He stopped before finishing the sentence. She nodded anyway. Most people do. She carried a clay cup filled with cool water and placed it within his reach. Fear is easier to teach than truth. Cole lifted the cup carefully. The cold water eased the dryness in his throat, but it did nothing to quiet the questions growing inside him. Why save me, he asked. I wear the wrong hat. I ride with the wrong people. Niyeli looked toward the sunlight pouring across the canyon entrance. When I was a little girl, my grandmother told me something. She picked up a bundle of drying sage and hung it beside the shelter opening. She said the land remembers every kindness, even when people do not. Cole studied her face. There was no bitterness there. Only a quiet sadness earned through years of hearing the same questions from different strangers. She reached into a woven basket and removed several smooth stones, placing them beside the fire one by one. A wounded traveler is still a traveler. She glanced back at him. Not an enemy. Cole lowered his eyes. Memories drifted through his mind like dust across an empty trail. Every warning his father had spoken. Every story repeated inside the saloon. Every joke that turned another human being into something less. None of those voices matched the woman standing only a few feet away. He noticed the calluses on her hands from gathering roots, the faded stitching along her buckskin sleeves, and the quiet patience with which she worked. Nothing about her resembled hatred. Before he could speak again, an elderly Apache man stepped into the shelter carrying a weathered walking stick polished smooth by decades of use. He looked at Cole with calm gray eyes before turning to Niyeli. They exchanged a few words in Apache that Cole could not understand. The old man nodded once, then left without another glance. Cole frowned. What did he say? Niyeli looked down at the leather pouch holding the bullet before answering softly. He said strangers rarely arrive by accident. She tightened the blue cord around the pouch once more. And sometimes the smallest piece of lead carries the largest truth. The next morning arrived without the sound of church bells or wagon wheels. Instead, Cole woke to the steady rhythm of a wooden pestle grinding herbs somewhere outside the shelter. Sunlight slipped through the opening above, warming the rough blanket across his legs while the scent of cedar smoke mixed with fresh sage and pine resin. For the first time in several days, the weight pressing against his shoulder had become a dull reminder instead of a sharp warning. He eased himself upright, expecting the pain to force him back down, but it did not. His body felt weak, yet strangely lighter. Near the doorway, Niyeli sat beside a flat stone, crushing green leaves into a smooth paste. She did not look up immediately. It was as though she already knew he was awake simply by the change in his breathing. Walk a little today, she said quietly. Healing belongs to those who meet it halfway. Cole managed a careful smile. You always speak like that. She finally looked at him. Only to stubborn men. The answer caught him off guard, and for the first time since arriving, he laughed. It was brief, almost unfamiliar, but it felt honest. He stepped outside slowly, blinking against the bright Arizona sun. The canyon stretched wide beneath a cloudless sky, its red cliffs glowing above patches of cottonwood and juniper. A narrow stream wound through the valley, clear enough for smooth stones to shine beneath the water. Women gathered medicinal plants along the bank while several children skipped flat rocks across the surface, cheering whenever one bounced farther than the last. An older man repaired a saddle beneath the shade of a large tree, humming softly while another carved a wooden toy horse for a little girl who watched with patient eyes. No one stared at Cole. No one pointed toward him. A few nodded politely before returning to their work, treating him less like a prisoner and more like another traveler passing through the valley. The quiet acceptance unsettled him in ways anger never could. He wandered only a few yards before stopping beside the stream. His reflection stared back from the water, weary beneath his weathered hat. He noticed fresh stitches holding together the tear in his shirt near the shoulder. Someone had repaired it while he slept. He knew without asking who had done it. Behind him, Niyeli approached carrying a woven basket filled with roots and flowering stems. She knelt beside the water and rinsed each plant carefully before placing it back into the basket. Cole watched her hands moving with the same steady confidence she had shown while treating his wound. You could have left me where I fell, he said quietly. No one would have blamed you. She continued washing the herbs. Would you have blamed yourself? The question settled over the water like morning mist. Cole searched for an answer, but found only silence. She reached into her pocket and removed the small leather pouch tied with the faded blue cord. Opening it carefully, she placed the gray bullet in the palm of her hand. Sunlight caught the dull metal as she turned it slowly. I have seen many bullets, she said. Hunters use one shape. Soldiers use another. Ranch guards prefer a different mold. She looked directly into his eyes. This one was made by the blacksmith in Dry Creek. Cole frowned. You know our blacksmith? I know his work. She closed her fingers around the bullet. Every craftsman leaves a signature, even when he does not realize it. A cool breeze rippled across the stream, carrying the scent of wild mint through the canyon. Cole stared at the pouch, then toward the distant horizon where Dry Creek waded beyond the red ridges. The road home suddenly seemed farther away than the miles between them, because for the first time he began to wonder if the greatest danger he had escaped had never come from this valley at all. The days that followed passed without anyone counting them. The sun climbed above the canyon each morning, painting the cliffs in shades of amber before settling into the endless blue sky, and each evening the desert cooled beneath a blanket of quiet stars. Cole found himself walking a little farther every sunrise. At first it was only a few yards beyond the shelter, then to the stream, then across the small meadow where children laughed while chasing one another through the tall grass. His shoulders still ached whenever he reached too high, but strength returned one careful step at a time. He disliked sitting still, so he searched for ways to earn his place. When he noticed an old corral gate hanging crooked from worn leather hinges, he gathered loose cedar branches and repaired it without being asked. The elderly ranch hand who cared for the horses examined the finished work, nodded once, and quietly handed Cole a fresh apple before leading the animals inside. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The next afternoon, Cole discovered a young colt refusing to cross the shallow creek. He spoke softly to the nervous animal, resting one hand against its neck until it finally stepped into the cool water. Several Apache children watched from the bank with wide smiles. One little boy clapped his hands while a girl no older than 8 offered Cole a handful of fresh berries gathered from nearby bushes. He accepted them with a grateful smile, realizing that trust often arrived in the smallest gestures. Later that evening, Niyeli found him repairing the handle of a worn wooden bucket outside the shelter. She knelt beside him and placed several fresh willow strips on the ground. Use these, she said. They bend without breaking. Cole looked at the smooth green branches before weaving them carefully into the cracked handle. Everything here seems to have another purpose. Niyeli smiled faintly. The land wastes nothing. She invited him to walk with her the following morning before sunrise. Together they followed a narrow trail, climbing nearly half a mile along the canyon wall until the first light touched the distant mesas. She showed him how crushed sage released a stronger scent before rain arrived, and how cottonwood leaves turned pale underneath when the wind shifted from the west. She pointed toward tiny animal tracks crossing the dusty ground. Rabbit, she said softly. A few yards later she stopped again. Fox. Cole stared at marks that looked nearly identical to him. How do you know? She looked toward the horizon. Because the earth speaks slowly. Most people simply hurry past before hearing it. The words lingered with him long after they returned to the valley. In the evenings, while families gathered around small cooking fires, Cole often noticed Niyeli sitting apart, sorting dried herbs into cloth pouches tied with faded blue thread. She worked with quiet patience, never rushing, never wasting a single leaf. One night, he carried a stack of freshly cut firewood to her shelter without saying a word. She looked at the neatly piled logs, then at him. Thank you, she said. You noticed. Cole shrugged gently. You keep saving everyone else. Someone should make your day easier. She lowered her eyes for a moment before placing the familiar leather pouch containing the bullet beside the fire. The blue cord caught the flickering light. Neither of them touched it. Neither of them needed to. Both understood that the small piece of lead still carried answers neither was ready to face. Above them the evening breeze stirred the cottonwood branches, and somewhere beyond the canyon rim a lone rider's silhouette appeared against the fading sunset before disappearing just as quickly, unnoticed by everyone except the old gray horse tied quietly beneath the nearest tree. 3 mornings later, the quiet rhythm of the canyon changed. It began with the ravens. They circled above the western ridge instead of settling among the cottonwoods, their sharp calls cutting through the cool air before sunrise. The old gray horse tied near the corral lifted its head, ears pointed toward the distant trail. Even the children stopped chasing one another long enough to look at the cliffs. Cole noticed the change before anyone spoke. He had spent enough years riding open country to know that animals often sensed visitors long before people did. Niyeli stepped from her shelter, carrying 2 small bundles of dried herbs. She looked toward the ridge without a word, then slowly placed the bundles back inside. "Someone is coming," Cole said. She nodded. "Yes." They climbed together to a narrow overlook nearly 100 yards above the valley floor. The morning light stretched across the desert, revealing a thin cloud of dust drifting between the red mesas. Cole narrowed his eyes until he recognized several mounted riders moving in careful formation. They were still too far away for faces to become clear, but the saddles, hats, and pace looked painfully familiar. "They are from Dry Creek," he whispered. His stomach tightened before he even understood why. Niyeli remained calm. "Do they know you are alive?" Cole hesitated. "If they did not before, they will soon." The riders disappeared behind another ridge, but the dust remained floating in the morning air like a warning that refused to fade. Back in the valley, the elders quietly gathered beside the central fire. No one shouted. No one rushed. Mothers called children closer, while older boys led the horses toward shaded ground beneath the canyon wall. The camp moved with practiced calm instead of fear. Cole watched the quiet preparation and realized these people had learned long ago that peace required patience. An elderly man unfolded a weathered map across a flat stone. Another filled leather water bags without wasting a single motion. Niyeli knelt beside the fire and continued grinding herbs as though the sound itself steadied everyone's heart. Cole could not remain still. "If those riders find this place..." He stopped before finishing. Niyeli looked up. "They will find people making breakfast." Her answer surprised him. "You are not preparing for a fight." She shook her head gently. "No healer hopes for one." Cole walked toward the stream, searching for thoughts that refused to settle. Near the water, he noticed fresh hoofprints crossing the soft mud. They were deeper than those left by the tribe's horses. Someone had already entered the valley during the night. He followed the tracks until they disappeared among scattered rocks where a folded scrap of paper rested beneath a small stone. He picked it up carefully. Across the front, written in hurried pencil, were only 6 words. "We know the cowboy is alive." Cole felt the morning breeze turn suddenly cold. There was no signature, no explanation, only certainty. He carried the note back to Niyeli without speaking. She read the words once before placing the paper into the same leather pouch that held the gray bullet. The blue cord tightened around both secrets together. She looked toward the western ridge where the distant riders had vanished from sight. "Now there are 2 truths traveling together," she said quietly. Cole frowned. "What do you mean?" Niyeli held the pouch against her heart for a brief moment before answering. "Someone wanted you found." She lifted her eyes to meet his. "Someone else wanted you never to return home." By late afternoon, the riders finally appeared along the ridge above the canyon, their horses slowing as they reached the overlook. There were nearly 30 of them, enough to stir a cloud of pale dust that drifted through the still desert air before settling over the rocks. Cole recognized several hats before he could distinguish the faces beneath them. Ranch hands from Dry Creek. 2 deputies. A freight driver who had once shared coffee with him before sunrise. They were men he had trusted without question. Now they sat quietly above a valley filled with people who had saved his life. The distance between the 2 groups measured less than 300 yards, yet it felt wider than every mile he had ever ridden across the frontier. An older deputy named Walter Haynes guided his horse a few steps forward and raised one open hand. His voice carried clearly through the canyon. "Cole Barrett, we know you are down there." Every conversation in the valley stopped. Mothers gathered children closer. The elders remained standing beside the cooking fire. No one reached for a weapon. No one answered. Cole stepped forward before anyone else could move. Niyeli gently touched his sleeve. "You do not have to go." He looked at her calm eyes and slowly shook his head. "If I stay silent now, someone else will choose the story for me." He climbed the winding trail alone until he reached the open ground between the 2 sides. The afternoon wind tugged gently at the brim of his weathered hat, while the smell of warm sandstone and dry sage surrounded him. Walter studied him with visible relief. "Thank heaven. We thought they had taken you." Cole answered quietly. "No one took me." A murmur spread through the riders. One man frowned. "Then why are you still here?" Cole looked back toward the valley where Niyeli stood beside the stream, the blue cord of the leather pouch resting against her shoulder. He turned again to face the men he had known for years. "Because they saved my life." Several riders exchanged uneasy glances. A younger ranch hand spoke before anyone could stop him. "That is not what we were told." Cole nodded slowly. "I know." Walter guided his horse another few feet forward. "Come home with us. We can sort everything else out later." Cole did not move. "Can we?" His quiet question lingered in the air. "Will the truth still matter after we leave this canyon?" No one answered immediately. The silence grew heavier than any shouted argument. Then another rider pushed his horse to the front. Cole recognized him at once. Ethan Crowley, a ranch foreman with polished boots and an easy smile that had always seemed trustworthy. Ethan removed his gloves one finger at a time. "You have been through a hard few days, Cole," he said warmly. "You are confused. Let us get you home before these people fill your head with more stories." Cole stared at him. Something about the man's calm voice felt different now. Carefully chosen. Too careful. Without thinking, Cole glanced toward Niyeli. She had not moved. She simply rested one hand over the leather pouch holding both the bullet and the folded note. Their eyes met across the canyon. She gave the smallest shake of her head. It was enough. Cole looked back at Ethan. "Tell me something," he said softly. "If everyone believed I was dead." He paused until every rider focused on him. "Who wrote the note saying I was alive before any of you ever reached this valley?" The question settled over the canyon like the first shadow before sunset. This time, even the wind seemed to stop. For several long seconds, no one answered. The horses shifted uneasily, leather saddles creaked, and somewhere below a creek continued its quiet journey through the canyon as though it had witnessed scenes like this for centuries. Walter Haynes slowly turned toward Ethan Crowley. The younger ranch hands followed his gaze, each waiting for someone else to speak first. Ethan forced a small smile that never reached his eyes. "Anyone could have written a note," he said. "Perhaps someone followed us." Cole remained still. During the past week, he had learned that truth often revealed itself in silence before it appeared in words. "No," he replied calmly. "The note was left before you arrived. Whoever wrote it already knew I had survived." Walter frowned. "How could that be?" Before Ethan could answer, quiet footsteps approached from behind Cole. Niyeli climbed the trail carrying the familiar leather pouch. She stopped beside him without a trace of fear and untied the faded blue cord. First, she removed the folded note. Then she placed the gray bullet into the palm of her hand. The afternoon sun reflected softly from its worn surface. She held it toward Walter instead of Ethan. "May I ask you something?" she said politely. Walter nodded. "Who makes ammunition for Dry Creek?" "Elias Turner," Walter answered without hesitation. "He has worked the forge for almost 20 years. Niyeli gently turned the bullet so its narrow groove caught the light. "He carves a tiny mark near the base of every mold." Walter leaned closer from his saddle. His weathered face slowly changed. "That mark is his." A murmur spread through the riders. Ethan folded his arms but remained silent. Cole looked from the bullet to Walter. "She recognized it the day she removed it from my shoulder." Walter's eyes widened. "Then whoever fired this used ammunition bought in Dry Creek." "Exactly," Cole answered. "Not from this valley." The old deputy removed his hat and scratched the gray hair above his forehead. The certainty he had carried into the canyon began slipping away. An elderly Apache man slowly climbed the trail carrying his polished walking stick. Cole had seen him only a few times, yet every person in the valley stepped aside respectfully as he approached. The old man stopped before Walter and reached beneath his woven blanket. Instead of drawing a weapon, he unfolded a weathered piece of buckskin wrapped around something small. Inside rested an old silver pocket watch with a cracked crystal. Walter stared at it for a long moment before whispering, "I know that watch." Cole looked at him in surprise. Walter nodded slowly. "It belonged to your father." Cole felt the ground beneath his boots seem suddenly unsteady. The old Apache elder spoke quietly in careful English. "Your father lost this many winters ago beside the northern river." He looked toward Niyeli before continuing. He did not lose it during a fight. Niyeli lowered her eyes. My grandfather found him alone with a fever after his horse threw him into the rocks. The elder gently placed the watch into Cole's trembling hands. He carried your father 3 miles to shelter, cared for him through 4 nights, and when he recovered, your father promised he would return the kindness one day. Cole slowly opened the cracked watch. Inside the cover, nearly hidden beneath years of wear, were 3 faded words carved by hand. Never forget mercy. His throat tightened. Walter quietly removed his own hat again. Across the ridge, every rider remained completely still. The promise Cole had never known his father made had somehow crossed an entire generation, waded through years of silence, and finally found its way back into his hands. No one spoke after the old pocket watch changed hands. The canyon seemed to hold its breath while the fading sunlight rested across the weathered silver case. Cole traced the worn engraving with his thumb as memories he had never lived somehow settled inside him. His father had rarely spoken about the frontier, and when he did, he always ended the stories before explaining how they truly finished. Standing between 2 worlds, Cole finally understood why. Some promises were too important to become campfire tales. They were meant to be honored instead. Walter Haynes slowly guided his horse down from the ridge until he stood only a few feet away. He looked first at the watch, then at the bullet resting quietly in Niyeli's open hand. I have known your father for 30 years, he said softly. He once told me that the finest people he ever met were strangers whose names the town would never believe. Walter lowered his eyes for a moment. I thought it was just another old cowboy story. The elder smiled gently. Sometimes truth survives because people mistake it for a story. A few of the younger riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. One by one, hats were removed. The certainty they had carried into the canyon continued to fade beneath facts no one had expected to find. Ethan Crowley remained silent longer than anyone else. Then he laughed quietly, though nothing about the sound carried warmth. A watch proves kindness, he said. It does not explain why Cole was found wounded. Cole closed the silver case and slipped it carefully into his vest pocket. No, he answered, but the bullet might. He looked toward Walter. Will Elias Turner recognize his own work? Walter nodded without hesitation. He recognizes every mold he has ever made. Cole continued. Then when we return to Dry Creek, he can tell us who purchased ammunition from that batch. Ethan's expression changed for only a heartbeat, but it was enough. The calm confidence that had followed him all afternoon disappeared behind tightened shoulders and careful breathing. Niyeli noticed it as quickly as Cole did. She quietly tied the faded blue cord around the leather pouch again, protecting both the bullet and the folded note inside. The truth has waited this long, she said. It can wait one more day. Evening settled gently across the valley. Long shadows stretched beneath the cottonwoods while the first stars appeared above the western cliffs. Walter looked back at the riders behind him. We will camp outside the canyon tonight, he announced. No one enters without invitation. Not a single deputy questioned the order. Several men quietly dismounted and began gathering firewood from the open hillside, instead of riding farther into the valley. It was a small decision, but everyone noticed it. Respect had quietly replaced suspicion. Cole walked back toward the stream beside Niyeli. The cool desert breeze carried the scent of cedar smoke and fresh bread from the evening fires. After a long silence, he stopped beside the clear water and slowly removed the Colt revolver that had been returned to him 2 days earlier. He looked at the familiar grip before kneeling at the edge of the stream. Then, without ceremony or dramatic words, he laid the revolver gently upon a flat stone between himself and the Apache elder who had followed them. The old man studied the gesture before nodding once. Cole met his eyes. My father owed your family a promise, he said quietly. I cannot repay his debt. He glanced toward Niyeli, who stood beside the flowing water with the leather pouch resting against her heart. But I can make certain it is never forgotten again. Above them the cottonwood leaves stirred softly in the evening wind, carrying away the last light of day while a new promise, spoken without raising a single voice, settled over the canyon like the coming night. The following morning dawned beneath a sky so clear that every distant mesa seemed close enough to touch. Cool air drifted through the canyon, carrying the scent of cedar, sage, and fresh coffee from the small fires burning near the stream. Before the first rays of sunlight reached the valley floor, Cole, Walter, Niyeli, and the Apache elder began the ride toward Dry Creek. No one hurried. The leather pouch with its faded blue cord rested safely inside Cole's saddlebag beside the silver pocket watch, two small objects that had quietly changed the course of many lives. By noon they reached the blacksmith shop, where the steady ringing of steel against iron echoed across the town square. Elias Turner looked up from his anvil, wiped his hands on a heavy apron, and smiled with relief when he saw Cole alive. That smile disappeared the moment Walter placed the gray bullet onto the workbench. Elias picked it up carefully, turning it beneath the sunlight until his fingers found the tiny mark near its base. He sighed before anyone asked a single question. "That mold belongs to me," he admitted quietly. "I only made 12 boxes from this batch." Walter folded his arms. "Who bought them?" Elias walked to a dusty ledger resting on a nearby shelf and slowly turned several pages. His finger stopped beside one familiar name. Ethan Crowley. Silence filled the forge. No one looked surprised anymore. The missing pieces had finally found each other without a single accusation. Walter closed the ledger gently. "That is enough." Outside, word spread through Dry Creek faster than the afternoon wind. By sunset, people who had once whispered fearful stories about the Apache camp gathered quietly in front of the general store, not to argue, but simply to listen. Walter told them exactly what had happened. Cole spoke only once. He described the woman who had saved his life, the elder who had once saved his father, and the kindness that had survived longer than anger ever could. He never raised his voice. He never asked anyone to change. He only told the truth. Sometimes that was enough. A week later, several wagons traveled back to the canyon carrying flour, tools, blankets, seed, and fresh lumber. No speeches welcomed them. No ceremony marked the moment. The gifts were accepted with quiet gratitude, and before the sun reached its highest point, cowboys and Apache families worked side by side repairing fences washed loose by spring rain. Children who had once watched one another from a distance now skipped stones across the creek together, laughing whenever one bounced farther than the last. Near the same stream where everything had begun, Cole handed the silver pocket watch to the old elder. The old man smiled and gently closed Cole's fingers around it again. "It belongs to your family now," he said. "The promise belongs to both of us." Cole nodded before turning toward Niyeli. She untied the faded blue cord one final time and removed the gray bullet. Without a word, she walked to the flowing water and released it into the creek. The current carried the small piece of lead between smooth stones until it disappeared beneath the clear surface forever. Cole watched it vanish before quietly saying, "Some things are better left behind." Niyeli smiled. "Only after they teach us where to walk next." Years later, travelers passing through Dry Creek often noticed something unusual. Whenever a wagon headed toward the canyon carrying medicine, food, or supplies, one rider always volunteered to escort it, no matter the season or the distance. The townspeople simply smiled when newcomers asked why. They would glance toward the western horizon where red cliffs met the endless sky and answer with the same quiet words. "Out here, a promise can cross generations. And the strongest man is the one who remembers mercy long after everyone else